Buenas tardes a todos y todas desde la Escuela Española de Historia y Arqueología en Roma. Bienvenidos nuevamente a las conferencias de Online Talk que volvemos a retomar este año 2022. Los próximos días os mandaremos por miscelánea Mesolítica y Neolithic miscelánea el programa completo del año. Como sabéis, las conferencias que organizamos las hacemos con nuestros colegas Miriam Cubas de la Universidad de Alcalá y Harry Robson de la Universidad de York. Y queremos dar las gracias, evidentemente, a la dirección y compañeros de la escuela del CSIC y en especial a Mateo Benati, que está en la parte técnica y que nunca se le ve. Well, your question you can do by YouTube. And remember, all conference will be recorded on YouTube too. It's a pleasure to introduce you to, Svein Vatsvåg, Nielsen or Nielsen?
Nielsen.
Well, okay. Nielsen is a PhD candidate in archaeology at the Department of Archaeology at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. Nielsen has worked with archaeological excavation in Nordic country and has the last years focused his research on the Neolithic period. His dissection of population dynamics at the Neolithization process in Southern Norway will be submitted this spring. Nielsen's main interest in research are diverse, from the first-hand technological analysis of the lithic assemblage to the novel statistical analysis of long-term demographic trends. Thank you, Svein. It's more easy for me. You have around 45 minutes, and after the people send you the question by YouTube, okay?
Yeah, sounds fine. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me for having this presentation. It's not that often that you get to present things now during the pandemic period, so I'm really happy to be here. As you said, I'm a PhD candidate in Oslo, and I'm working on finishing my thesis at the moment. So this presentation will be based on some of the results from my ongoing research. So the title of my presentation is Trial and Error: New Perspectives on the Deneolithization Process in Southern Norway. So for those of you who don't know, let's see. I have to there. Those of you who don't know, this is the region that we usually call Southern Norway in Scandinavia. Norway is this long country up in the north with lots of mountains. So this is the place we're going to talk about today. In this presentation, I will talk first about the landscape here and some of the research background. Then I'm going to talk about what the Denalization is. And in the end, we'll look a bit more closely at some recent lessons from studies in population dynamics. So first about the landscape and the research. Norway is known for its long coastal area, but there are also huge variations in the geography. Here we have a photo of one of the Neolithic sites located on the Hardangervidda mountain plateau. It's a place where people have been hunting reindeer, crossing the lake in the Neolithic period and also in more recent periods. So as mentioned, Norway has a very varied geography. Very little space is used for agriculture. As we can see, it's mostly in Eastern Norway and Central Norway. There's also areas here in Southwest, but it's actually less than 4% of the land cover is used for agriculture, and it's much more of the land cover are wetlands, and mostly it's boreal forests and alpine heath communities. So the natural scene for farming is not nearly as great here as in most regions, maybe in Europe. There's also big differences in the elevation, as mentioned. The lowlands in southern Norway are mostly in the eastern region and along the coast. And there's also a very big difference between the western and the eastern region when it comes to annual precipitation. Bergen in western Norway is one of the wettest cities in the world, and it's a big difference there between the west and the east. And this is, as we will see, also reflected greatly in the archaeological record from the Neolithic period. So just to take some regional terms, in Norway we often talk about the Oslo Fjord region, which is in eastern Norway, south of Oslo, the capital, and we have the Skagerrak coast and the west coast and the northwest coast. And as part of my PhD project, I have been trying to get an overview of the settlement data, site data from southern Norway that's relevant for the Neolithic research, and it is counting more than 500 sites at the moment. Some of these are late Mesolithic, but most are from the Neolithic period. And almost all of these sites are open air hunting, fishing, and gathering sites. But of course, the natural topography is only one part of the way to look at the landscape, and the landscape is always perceived from somewhere. And just to take an example that's probably well known to many of you, is the Catalan Atlas from 1375, where here we see it upside down actually, but we can see the Mediterranean Sea, and up here we see Norway, as one Norwegian researcher called it, a pile of rocks up in or down in the north. So this is just an example of how people view the landscape, but sometimes it's we have to consider that perceptions has played a vital role in how people have settled in the past. Here we see a picture of more than 8,000 megaliths in Scandinavia and northern Germany, and you see the northernmost are located here, right next to the big pile of rocks in Norway. So this is the Oslo Fjord region, when we have some of the northernmost, perhaps the northernmost megaliths in Scandinavia. So in Norway, in both the east and the western tradition, we follow the chronology that's developed for southern Scandinavia, for Denmark and Sweden. And this is mostly because of the well-dated context in those regions and the widespread trade of artifacts, axes, and also pottery that we see in the Neolithic period that is used for dating in Norway as well. The period that we will focus more on later is the Denalization, which is the start of the 3rd millennium BC. And here we just an example of the pottery phases from the Scandinavian countries, and we see that in Norway, in Denmark and Sweden, they are largely based on the publications and analysis of many assemblages. But in Norway, we have not as many sites with pottery, and when we discuss these sites, it's mostly in terms of the site names. So the background of the start of the Neolithic in Scandinavia, or the start of the funnel beaker culture, was summarized some years back by Johannes Müller, with the recognition of this interaction zone between the three societies that was organized in totally different ways, which is reflected at a few sites with early funnel beakers in the North European plain. So this is the network that created the funnel beaker culture, stated by Johannes Müller. We see an example of the earliest funnel beaker types from Denmark, from Eva Koch's publication. And shortly after this first appearance of pottery, the funnel beaker culture is spread all around in southern Scandinavia. So the backdrop of this in Norway is quite different. It has been recognized for many years, actually, that during the late Ertebølle period, when there was pottery production in southern Sweden and Denmark, and but also evidence of quite marked regional variations in the Ertebølle areas, we have seen that there appears lithic technology on coastal settlement sites in eastern Norway with artifacts typical of the Ertebølle period. In the map to the left here, we see the yellow dots or sites from the last 500 years of the Mesolithic, with finds of these transverse arrowheads, and we see them spreading all the way from western Sweden to eastern Norway, further west, and they end up in the southwestern region. There have been found a couple of transverse arrowheads north of the southwest, but there is also much more evidence of the continuity and the Mesolithic traditions. There's also one find of a bone comb that's possibly of a Ertebølle type found here in Rogaland in the southwest. And we see the same differences in the early Neolithic. There is a huge change in eastern Sweden that's well known with the appearance of the funnel beaker culture. But we see also that the early Neolithic pottery in eastern Norway distribute along the same area as there was interaction before during the late Ertebølle. And there is also we see on the central western coast, there appears a very different phenomenon, not only hunter-fisher-gatherer sites and extensive use of a local material called rhyolite. So the funnel beaker culture in Scandinavia, in Sweden at least, is recognized south of the Limes Norlandicus, which is a traditional border zone between the northern and southern vegetation zones in Sweden. So this zone was defined by Linné, but it has never been studied that intensely in Norway. But usually, the Oslo Fjord region is considered part of this area, and it has been pointed out previously by research that it seems to function as a sort of limit in Norway as well. Here to the left, we see the place of the Hammermoen site, which was excavated a little more than 10 years ago. Now, which is it's been interpreted as an enclosure site with the ritually deposited funnel beakers. It's been well dated to the early Neolithic period, and interpreted as an enclosure for foragers. So in Norway, we have a few megaliths around the Oslo Fjord. One is just north of the Swedish border, and there is a concentration even further north at Hurum, where there were possibly four dolmens. So here we can see the reconstruction of the dolmen at Kjelltorp, excavated a long time ago, and we have more recent excavations at Holtenes 1 and Holtenes 3. And these dolmens are similar to the northern one types from Sweden. And we have the northernmost from Masleberg in Skien, Sweden. So the dolmens in Norway in the Oslo Fjord region have all been located quite close to the sea. As we see in the map here on the right, around that time, the sea level was about 25 meters higher. So the dolmens must have been placed quite close to the sea, and people have, well, probably come there by boat. The dates are all in line with the dolmens from Western Sweden, and they are most probably part of the exact same phenomenon. But there are finds of imported pottery, as here from Kjelltorp but there are also finds inside these dolmens of more local lithic artifacts, such as these arrowheads and scrapers and flakes. So today it's there are a few settlement sites in the Oslo Fjord region from the early Neolithic period that suggests that there was a change in settlement organization and a bit away from the coast, and that farming was possibly introduced in this, or husbandry was possibly introduced in this period. However, there are no directly dated bones from domesticates or civils from these early centuries of the Neolithic. But after about 3,300 BC, when we enter the Middle Neolithic, there are directly dated domesticates west of Oslo. So recently excavated site called Kvastad, A2, where there were Hodeum and Triticum civils dated to around 3,200, 3,300 BC. And there is a bone from Stangelandshellan dated to the Middle Neolithic, and there was also the site Kotedalen on the central western coast with the not directly dated cereals, but pollen from pits on this coastal settlement. So the thing in the Oslo Fjord region is that the sites that's possibly used for farming which are these green windows on the figure here, the diamonds. They all connect through the waterways, either on the coast or along the inland waterways, ways and lakes. So there's no doubt that these places were could be traveled through almost only by use of boats, and sometimes just a walk up on towards the inland. Now the purple dots are the distribution of flint axes, the thin dotted flint axes that we see here on these photos, and the yellow dots are the point dotted flint axes from the same period. And here we have an example also of the pottery from the early Neolithic, and very similar pottery sherds found all the way up on the Hardangervidda mountain plateau. And here is a photo of the site Kotedalen on the western coast, where the pollen from Hodeum was found in several pits that was well dated to the Middle Neolithic. The site is mostly known for its rich inventory of locally produced pottery with imitated Coord impressions. So to sum up the research is that it seems that farming was introduced in the Oslo Fjord region very shortly after its introduction in southern Sweden and Denmark, and that it spread further west along the coast at the same time as dolmens were erected around the Oslo Fjord, or around the same period. So we would think that the case is closed, but there are other things that we need to take into account. For instance, there is the renewed dependence on coastal resources in the Middle Neolithic, in all of southern Norway, and also that it seems that the farming was completely disappeared or became much less important after 2800 BC. So here we see the sum diagrams published quite recently by Steinar Solheim with the directly dated cereals in eastern Norway, which show a huge pause in the Middle Neolithic. But this is not a pattern that's unique to Norway. So there are lots of studies from the last 10 or so years that show that farming was stopping, or at least becoming less important around the same time. which is around the Middle Neolithic. We see here in Ireland, in the Middle Neolithic too, there are almost no sites. And there was also the transference model published by Stevenson Fuller for Britain, where they showed that the swirls were quite clearly much more numerous in the early Neolithic. And what we have to explain is how this can work together with the evidence of population decline in all over Northwestern Europe at the same time. So in Norway, this process has been called the Denalization. And here we see a photo from early 20th century from one of the islands outside Bergen, where farmers used to hunt whales during the season to sell on markets and to feed their own island population. So this is this mixed type of economy of farming combined with fishing and and whaling has been completely normal in Norway in historical times. But the Denalization was first introduced properly by Erik Hinch in his dissertation from 1955, and in short, it points to development from foraging to farming and back to foraging again. And what Hinch observed was that there was something strange going on in Eastern Norway in the Neolithic. There was a change in fine distribution of artifacts associated with early farming from inland oriented in the early Neolithic, more or less, to only coastally oriented in the middle Neolithic. And this happened at the same time as the appearance of rich coastal settlements focused on marine resources in southern Scandinavia, known as the pitware culture. Hinch argued that there was a total disappearance of farming, and he explained it not in terms of climate change or anything like that, but as simply as an anti-farming movement among the first farmers in Norway. He also admitted that it was not limited to Norway. This was seen in many other regions, particularly in Sweden. And he argued that it involved a mixture of immigrant farmers with the local foragers, and that the result of this was the pitware culture. So his conclusion was basically that the funnel beaker culture farmers had reached their ecological limit in the Oslo Fjord region, and that the farming there didn't really work. So we can still see this transition in the pottery from the latest funnel neck beakers in Eastern Norway. This is a vessel from Vatsvåg from right before 3000 BC, and then after 3000 BC we have this what seems to be a fully developed pottery, huge pots, some of them with decorated with the pits, but mostly with the Coord stamp, this fake Coord imprints on the vessels. And so the pitware culture is often referred to as simply as the Coord stamp culture in Norway, because the Coord stamp is what is most characteristic. But there is, of course, also continuity in trade. The same trade networks that we saw in the early Neolithic. There is the flint axis is still distributed north, and we also see the distribution of long flint blades to Norway during this period. In Norway, these blades were highly sought after because we see that on the coastal settlements they have been mass producing lithic arrowheads, these tangent used for hunting, but also for hunting marine mammals. There's also some evidence of grave rituals. We have very few Neolithic graves in Norway. This is one possible find from Kristiansand with imported flint axes, very long flint blades, and some of the longest slate arrowheads known from Southern Norway. But these same artifacts that we find on the coastal occupation sites, slate being used, and also flint for arrowheads. There are a couple of quite recent excavations on the Skagerrak coast that show that people also not only were fishing smaller fish species such as cod and were hunting whales, as we also knew, but that even the bluefin tuna was hunted during the season in the Middle Neolithic as well. So probably in August or September, with the harpoons and quite large fish hooks. So that now we've seen some what was the result of the denalization, and it's we see the appearance of these huge coastal settlements with much evidence of foraging, and there's some but little evidence of farming. Now we'll look a little bit on the results from studies on population dynamics. So as part of my PhD project, I've been collecting dates from excavation reports and other publications from Southern Norway, and it's now reaching more than 2,000 dates. Most of these are from the open air forager sites, and we can see here from the relative amount here of these. The green area of this is the Stone Age dates, and they from Stone Age sites, and they clearly become less numerous throughout the Neolithic period, while dates from excavations in agricultural areas in Norway increase quite much during the period. So this could reflect the changes in economy as well. Just to show some examples, the classic Stone Age site type in Norway is excavated with a grid network, manual excavation such as this to the left, Strømsvika. This is just one example. There were more than 10,000 artifacts, only lithic artifacts, and they were all found in an area of 54, little more than 54 square meters. And on the other hand, we have the sites on the right, such as Dunshi, right outside Oslo, where the excavation with the excavator, only 84 artifacts, only pottery, but a huge area was investigated, and we have here some of the earliest TRB pottery sherds from Norway. So the sites to the left are declining throughout the Neolithic, while there is an increase in sites located in this type of areas to the right. So these are now quite well-known figures in European research. It's become quite normal to use this SPD analysis to study the changes in population density or relative population size. So the figure A is just the raw binned SPD from the whole complete data set from Southern Norway. The B is just the same as we saw previously, where it's discriminate between the grid and excavator data. In C, we have simulated a long-term exponential curve, and it reveals that we have when we know that there was a change in economy, this was preceded by a population decrease. We see it most clearly here in the late Neolithic, where we have this population decrease, the blue area followed by the red. So when we make another model where we take into account this that there was an acculturation process in eastern Norway with one population, we see this even more clearly in the Ertebølle and early Neolithic period, that we seem to have a sort of bust to boom pattern where the population increased is coming after a period of a smaller population. So we can see this also spatially. During the bust period, at the end of the Mesolithic, we know that there is overall population decrease. We know that we can expect that from the SPD, but still we see a very strong increase in the southwestern region. And this is the outer limit of this area where we see a change in lithic technology. At some of the sites excavated there recently, there are finds of hundreds of transverse arrowheads and hunting focused almost exclusively on deer. We see in the boom period to the right, which is in the early Neolithic, there is an overall population increase, we know from the SPD, but we can also see that there is a slight increase in eastern Norway and also up on the high mountain plateau actually. But in eastern Norway, there is, as we have seen, there is a continuity in the lithic technology. There are a few changes as well, like the changes in axis. The stone axis imitate the thin-butted flint axis, but we are also seeing that there is a huge import. And we find these axes not only as stray finds, but also as chipped into pieces and made into other formal tools at the settlements. And then after about 3,700 BC, we saw that the population levels into a normal expected growth. So in case we would work with the theory that there was a demic diffusion or migrants coming into the Oslo Fjord region, then we would expect population to go through 3 stages. So first we would expect to see a copial phase, which would last probably a few hundred years. This would be a period of stable food supply, a blissful phase for early farmers. Population grows at maximum unconstrained rate, but the food availability would in reality be lowered after some time. Then comes a short transition phase with sharply worsening conditions for the population. So this is what Cedric Bjørnstad and colleagues call the invisible cliff in this scenario. As the population becomes sufficiently large that the environment is filled, leading to population decrease. And then comes the third phase, the Multituition Phase, where the population and food supply in the given area is in equilibrium. So generally harsher conditions than in the copial phase, but we see fertility matching mortality. And most importantly is that this stage will continue unless behavior is changed or the system was disturbed in some other way. So this could be an explanation for what we see in the population development. But in case of acculturation, which there is some evidence of in terms of how the sites are located close to waterways, and that there is actually evidence of continuity in the lithic industries in eastern Norway. Then we would expect that the forager mobility, that the density would be related directly to the level of mobility. So we can see this quite clearly in the figure to the right, where we see the number of residential moves per year against population density for 31 forager groups from the Robert Kelly's book. And there's a huge difference in mobility when when they reach about 50 people per 100 square kilometers. So with an increasing population, we would of foragers in southern Norway, we would expect them to become less mobile. So this is called a traveler processor model, which predicts that high density of foragers equals lowered mobility. So with a lowered mobility, it would encourage strategies to reduce the depletion rate of local resources. And within such a scenario, crop growing or husbandry could be considered relevant strategies for foragers. So one study by Gallagher and colleagues even argued that crop cultivation was simply a new means of reducing the depletion rate and increasing the replenishment rate, and that its association with the reduced health status is a consequence of a more stable and predictable food procurement consumption balance. So with this model of development and population, we could suggest the argument that the increase of foragers in eastern Norway would encourage the adoption of farming. So, reaching the end, what we have seen is that there is a long-term logistic population growth in southern Norway throughout the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic. And this leads to a peak after the adoption of farming. We've also seen that there is a population leveling and the stabilization after about 300 years of farming in eastern Norway. And there is also a further spread of farming along the coast, further west. And that this happened at the same time as there is a development of quite new foraging strategies. We see the large coastal sites often with thick cultural layers. There is a local pottery production in both eastern and western Norway. The population is now relies heavily on marine resources. There is seasonal exploitation of whales, and we see now also bluefin tuna. Farming is present but less important. And then we see a second bust boom period sometime around 2500 BC. But that is a huge chapter in this story that I will not comment on right now. So what this could mean is that farming was tested in the early Neolithic in eastern Norway for some time, and that this type of farming was modeled on experience from southern Scandinavia, but that it was actually adapted to the local environment in the middle Neolithic and then spread further west. So one of the interesting things to mention in the end is that this is actually not a new theory. This is very close to a theory called in Swedish research the Ransom hypothesis, which is actually a theory published by Hans Göransson in 1987, based on a study of Alvasta pile dwelling. So there are many points to his theory, but one of the most important one today, I think, is that Neolithic farmers in Sweden, in this case, they started to exploit the forest into a developed forest farming practice. So his theory was heavily criticized in the early 90s and mostly forgotten. One scholar suggested that this theory could be relevant to Norway. So Lisa Bjerk argued that the Middle Neolithic evidence in Eastern Norway can be interpreted as human groups living at the coast, utilizing the forested interior for grazing and perhaps some cultivation. Now we have evidence that there was cultivation. She also suggested that the Middle Neolithic groups in Eastern Norway moved to the coast not because they stopped all agricultural activity, but because they reduced their traditional dependence on forest hunting and fishing, that's freshwater fishing, and started to use the forest in a much more efficient manner. So for future research, I think this will become quite an important theory to explore, because we now see that there is evidence of farming coast there in the Middle Neolithic, and that it was combined with foraging. So that was a lot of information. I will say thank you and end with this photograph of the excavations at Skipshelleren, a rock shelter site in Western Norway. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Svein. That was very, very interesting. And you're in time as well, which is always good. Yeah, Miriam, Juan, do you have any questions? I'll ask you first, because I've got quite a few questions. Oh, you might have to correct me here. Gauta Reiten? I can never pronounce.
Yeah, Gauta.
No, I'm not too far off, yeah. She's asked a question. Okay, so she's asked, how come the oldest cereals and livestock bones date to the very period where a potential deneolithization took place, i.e. the first half of the Middle Neolithic, or is it just a coincidence?
I think that all of the directly dated, well, first of all, I think Gauta knows the answer to this, but I think all of the directly dated domesticates that's older than the late Neolithic and Bronze Age has been found on pure luck. So the tooth that was found in the Stangelandshelleren, the Bos domesticus from southwestern Norway, was found in a, as far as I know, not in a sealed stratigraphic sequence. I haven't talked to those who dated that tooth, but I reckon that it was quite a surprise when it came back with that date. And the cereals, the Chord cereals found on the Skagerrak coast at Kvastad, they were found together in the same excavation unit as late Neolithic cereals, Chord cereals, and also lithic flakes from bifacial technology, typical of the late Neolithic. So I think that we have found this by chance, but I think it's also it fits quite well with the change we see in the change in settlements. Because in Eastern Norway around Oslo, we see that the few sites where we think that farming, where I believe that farming was practiced, they have the typical site is an agricultural area where they move the topsoil. They found maybe 200 pits or post holes, and then they date 10 of them, and 1 or 2 give a Neolithic age. And then, because these are development-led excavations, cultural resource management, then they rarely have money to date anything more. So we are quite lucky to have even found these few sites that we have. And apart from these few deviations, we are, it's not sorry to say, but we are excavating much of the same stuff because we have the techniques we have to excavate them.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to learn something from the few devious finds that we have, for instance, at Kvasta, and go out and try to look for more because they are definitely out there.
Mm. Cool.
Wow.
Seems to have answered that question. I've got a couple of questions then. Okay, so you mentioned right at the start that you have these Erdebuller type transverse arrowheads, which are pretty much, well, yeah, contemporaneous as well with the final phase of the Erdebuller in, say, southern Scandinavia. Do you think it's the same population? Because, and also, are there any other materials and or evidence which is very comparable with, let's say, the classic sort of Erdebuller culture distribution?
Well, there is, we have to understand that the sites in question here are open air sites with almost exclusively just lithic artifacts. So bad preservation conditions for bone, and but it's this is a quite new theory, and it's still seen as a bit controversial. But because there hasn't been proposed that many explanations for why these arrowheads appear, it's quite easy to say in research that well, this area was under influence from that area, but that doesn't make much sense anymore. It made sense 50 years ago, but I think we need better explanations today. And one of the clues to explain it, in my opinion, is to look at the population data and also to what we can expect foragers to behave under these population conditions. So, for instance, in eastern Norway, or in southern Norway, there seems to be a decrease in population, and that would, in a sense, create a space for other groups to use as hunting grounds or fishing grounds. So I think that through time we have to allow, in a sense, we have to allow foragers to actually move around in the landscape. So we say often that the foragers were so mobile in the Stone Age as well, but we rarely allow them to move around. And I think that this is definitely a period when I think people moved not in the sense of like a huge migration north of southern Scandinavia into the Oslo Fjord region, but through time, I think that some of these hunting grounds and territories were expanded, and that they, over a few hundred years, had changed quite a lot.
Yeah, I also think we're probably quite focused even now on modern state boundaries and territories without actually thinking that these people are a lot more, well, they diffuse a lot and kind of intermingle and cross multiple water and landscapes. So yeah, that is a good point. Yeah, my other question then kind of leads on from that. So you mentioned towards the end about a change in economy, which was followed by a population decrease. Where do you think the people are going then? Is it possible, for instance, that, well, elsewhere in the Baltic, you've also got what people are now terming the process of de-Neolithization. So could it be that hunter-gatherer groups were living on the verge of farming societies? The farming societies then move, let's say, to the south because, let's say, their crops are failing or there's environmental influences or what have you. And then these hunter-gatherer groups move back in. So rather than a population replacement or a deneolithization process, could it just be population dualism?
Yeah,
so there's several points in there.
Well, I think that was that's always a possibility, and as far as I can remember, that was one of the explanations proposed by Carl Johan Becker in 1951 in his paper on the pityware culture in Scandinavia. He argued that when hunting grounds or fishing grounds in southern Scandinavia became open to use, then foragers from other regions of Norway and Sweden came there during the right seasons and stayed there and went home again. So that was the theory for many years, and there was for at least 20 years that was a big debate in Norway as well. When Norwegian scholars looked at the material we had here, and they saw that it was proposed that the same people had gone to, say, Jutland and settled there during some seasons and then come back. Of course, it created a lot of debate because the material in Jutland was, in many respects, quite different. So, of course, there are many theories that we need to explore further when it comes to this period.
Great, thanks. Miriam, Juan, do you have any questions?
Yes, sorry, I have a question. Because during your talk, you mentioned that pottery was mainly local made. And can we observe a continuation in the use of the raw material during this change from farming to foraging?
There hasn't been done that many studies of the wear on the pottery. I think that there was one scholar, Birgitta Hultén, made a few studies of Norwegian site material many years ago, but that was mostly macroscopic analysis. But I think that, well, what she found was that there was continuity in the Middle Neolithic pottery traditions in southern Norway, but there was also, the use of burnt bone that was, as far as I can remember, typical of the Eastern Swedish pitted ware, and but there is also some evidence of use of grog in the very latest phase of the Middle Neolithic. So towards the end, when this second bust period begins, then there is some evidence of grog use. But I'm sorry, I have read that there are some studies that argue that even the early Neolithic funnel beakers were produced locally. I've seen some have argued that as well, but I haven't really seen any study of the wear that can
Thank you, great, thank you.
Yeah, Miriam, you'll be interested in. Remember Heidi back in York Uni?
Yeah.
Master student. So she analysed some pitted ware pottery, which Svein and his colleagues provided from one of the sites he mentioned today, and they all had aquatic biomarkers.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then there's another site which I've analysed, but we haven't published it. It's in Hollandshavn in Bomlo. Boomlo.
Bömlo.
Yeah, that's the one. And again, the guy who provided that material, he said it was a funnel beaker influenced pottery, locally made. And again, pretty much all of that had aquatic biomarkers. And then when we did compound specific as well, they were all plotting within the marine ranges. So it's pretty conclusive evidence.
Yeah.
Even at that stage, it kind of does, let's say, conform to the process of deneolithization and this sort of turning the backs on the land and going back towards the sea. So, yeah, we'll have to write that up at some point, Svein. Amongst other things. And do you have any further questions? There's nothing more on the chat, unfortunately.
No, we don't have any question on the chat. Yeah, I was wondering, speaking about these technological elections that they use for tempering the pots and these kind of things, because as you well know, I love these coastal sites. So do you have any idea if they are using fish bones for temper or shells or something like that?
You ask me? I really don't know. I'm not an expert on
I know
on that field, but no, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how the bones are prepared, or it's for when it's used as tempering. I'm not really sure.
Okay, I will check the literature.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thanks ever so much, Svein. Really appreciate that. And yeah, thanks very much for a great talk. And hopefully I've not asked too many questions.
No, thank you for inviting me. It was really lovely to be here.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see each other at some point in the future.
In person, maybe.
Yeah, in person. Hopefully at a conference this year, if we can finally get there.
Yeah.
Great. Were there any closing remarks you wanted to make, Juan? Perhaps when's the next conference taking place? Next presentation, should I say?
You ask me?
I've asked Juan.
Yeah, I think Juan doesn't have the phone.
Okay.
For the audio?
I can't find the phone. That's okay. Okay, there'll be the next talk in. Let me just get it up. There'll be a next talk in the next month or so. One was muted, so unfortunately here we go. Yeah, so the next talk is going to be in May the 13th by Emanuela Cristiani, and it is on plant consumption and technology amongst Mesolithic foragers of the Balkans. And we'll be disseminating a poster of that in the not too distant future. Brilliant. Well, again, thanks ever so much, Svein, and we'll see each other soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Cheers all. Bye-bye.
Bye.